Freddie Gray's death on April 19th has sparked protests throughout Baltimore that suddenly turned violent earlier this week. So what do the protesters want? And what should federal, state, and local governments do in response? Moving forward, how can Hopkins students get involved in this issue? All this next on Politik Focus. Hi, I'm Emily Herman, and welcome to Politik Focus. On April 12th, a man named Freddie Gray, 25 years old, was arrested and sustained severe spinal injuries in the back of a police van, so severe that he lapsed into a coma and died on April 19th. Protests erupted throughout Baltimore, and they were peaceful until they turned violent on April 25th. Details had come out about the case, including the fact that Gray's spine was 80% severed from his neck by the time he received medical attention. After his wake on April 27th, the protests turned into riots, bringing international media attention to Baltimore. Over the past week, people have consciously tried to shift the focus away from violent protests and towards the important issues of inequality and racism in Baltimore. Joining us tonight to speak about these issues is Kennedy McDaniel, one of the freshman representatives of the Black Student Union, and Tiara Langley, the former vice president of the Black Student Union, who helped organize a massive student protest yesterday. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So, start in your own words. We'll start with you, Kennedy. What is going on here?
Okay, well, it started with the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore City, but and that's where all of the protests came from, because it was another death of a black male to police brutality. But there have been issues in Baltimore long before that, so it was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But we're talking about poverty and violence and all, like, a lot of negative things that occur in this city, which led up to the reason why people are so upset today.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would just add that, this is a pivotal moment in which Baltimore is sort of addressing sort of all the demons and structures and powers that be that have oppressed them for a very long time, for centuries even. Baltimore has always had a very large free black population, so the experience of Baltimoreans dealing with sort of a white overarching government are not just, I guess, related to right now and today. But I would say that this is the time that Baltimoreans are finally trying to take action in their own hands. And for a while they have been acting, but I think this is the moment where we're seeing the youth particularly involved and dedicated to creating a city that they want to see.
So there's a lot of mixed messages going on. People see one thing and think all sorts of different opinions, but what do you think people need to focus on here?
I think people need to focus on the oppressors, not the reactions from the oppressed. I think a lot of people are focused on some of the rioting or like the violence that broke out during the protests, but that was a direct reaction to police brutality and to an overarching oppressive government. And I think we need to focus on them and not anything else, because these uprisings and riots and anything else would not happen if we were living in a just society.
And I would just agree, again, that people need to focus on the value of Black lives and what the reaction is stemming from. Like, what's the root cause and what's the root issue? And it even goes beyond just police brutality to back to white supremacy. Like, where did police brutality come from? What structures originated or gave birth to police brutality? What governmental forms and regulations make it acceptable for oftentimes white officers to kill unarmed Black people, Black men, Black women, everyone.
So we're dealing with pretty heavy topics here, especially regarding race. Have you felt any pushback from fellow students or faculty about these issues? And what have your experiences been this past week with other members of the Hopkins community?
I think the initial response from the Hopkins community was overwhelmingly negative and racist and unacceptable. I think many of my peers and classmates and people that I eat with and like share the same floor with and have like hung out with are ignorant and racist. And I think that they proved that via social media, whether it be through Facebook or through Yik Yak or through Tumblr, just very coded language. Where they basically said, I love Baltimore and it's my home and I can't believe Black people are so violent and like I'm scared for my life. which I think is, one, an incredibly selfish point of view, where you're in one of the safest areas in Baltimore City, and you're concerned for your own safety when the police are a system that is made to protect you. Like, the police protect wealthy white people, and that is a lot of what the Hopkins population is. So I think the initial response was very negative and very selfish and disgusting.
And for the protest organized yesterday, there were only about 200 to 300 people that showed up. And I'm saying only as if, oh, this isn't a big number at all, but in comparison to, you know, the more than 1,000 people who are here and enrolled at Hopkins, it could have been larger, definitely. And so, I mean, I was expecting only about 70 to 80 people to show up, a dedicated, faithful few, but I mean, having that many students show up and participate in the protest sort of changed my view a little bit, but I'm still definitely sure that the reaction has been negative. And, you know, social media, especially Yik Yak, those comments can be reflective of things that are oftentimes unsaid, but instead just typed online. And I think that the administration especially has sort of not really issued a clear statement on how they feel about not just what's happening to like what happened to Freddie Gray, but I think they haven't issued a clear statement on how they feel about Baltimoreans in general, and Baltimore as a city, like where they stand, and how much they want to support, and where they're not going to support. And I think that's very intentional. So I think it's just the in general reaction. I would characterize it as the typical Hopkins sort of apathy, sort of middle of the road, don't really know where you stand.
So what responsibility do you think Hopkins has as an institution? Like, what should the university do going forward to kind of help because since they're such a big part of Baltimore, they have a lot to do with the way the city runs and the way money is spent in the city. What do you think Hopkins should do?
Yes, I mean,
I think that Hopkins has gentrified Baltimore City for years, and they had a lot to do in terms of reparations for Baltimore residents and specifically Black citizens of Baltimore. The relationship between Baltimore and Hopkins is not a good one, and I think we're all aware of that. So going forward, I think that Hopkins needs to, I want to expand their Baltimore Scholars Program, I would say.
Target more high schools,
Yeah, target more Baltimore City public high schools, even if there were if there was a program to, where high school students could take classes here, which I don't think is offered at all. Things like that, where we're doing actual positive on-the-ground work to make up for the terrible, terrible history that Hopkins has in Baltimore.
And even present day, like with the Hopkins, the Henry School over near the medical campus, and how I've heard some stories about parents in that area saying, oh, well, we got sort of a letter in the mail saying you can enroll your child in this school, but they never gave like a set date or something. Some type of information was lacking. And then when they brought the child to the school on the first day, I mean, they were turned away. And so it seemed, you know, Hopkins does these things where they seem like they're for the community, but in actuality, it really isn't. And I think people are aware of that, and I think Hopkins, as like the #1 employer in the state of Maryland, needs to do more, not just by offering jobs, but by coming out and issuing a strong stand and statement, like to make up their mind and to fully support the community. So in the efforts right after sort of the uprisings, a couple of days ago, I think there were some Hopkins students who went downtown to give out food and water and things like that, especially in some of the areas well hit sort of by some of the destruction. But Hopkins could have mobilized on that, right, and taken advantage of that and issued a formal email. I mean, I'm not quite sure, did they send an email? You know, I'm not a student technically, so.
They're saying a lot of very generic stuff, like we stand with Baltimore, your safety is like our priority, violence is never the answer, like very
typical middle of the road.
Yeah, very typical stuff. I think that Hopkins and Hopkins likes the appearance of having a good relationship with Baltimore, and they like the appearance that they're doing good in the city, but I don't think that they actually do anything.
Or like put in the work. And I mean, I recognize that there are some people within Hopkins administration that actually want to change, but I think there's a problem sort of institutionally with actually affecting this change. So I hear a lot of ideas, I'm like, oh my gosh, it sounds really great. And they're like, oh yeah, but we're running into a wall finding funding, or oh, I can't get that many professors to actually sign on to sort of this plan to have this different major offered, or to build up this department, or to make this center go from a center into a department. So it's like there could be more done, and I think we as students expect the administrations to be more in line with sort of our peer institutions.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit, the media. So there's been a lot of controversy about how all of these events are being portrayed, because international attention is on Baltimore now. Like, we're quote unquote the new Ferguson. So what do you think about how the media has portrayed the situation to the rest of the world, and who's getting it right? Is anyone getting it right?
No, not CNN. Oh, say this? Oh my gosh. I mean, the media definitely is always around, especially. So let me say back up. They're around to sensationalize things, and so they'll pick up the scenes where it's like people destroying cop cars, but they won't pick up the scenes where police officers are lunging at a man for having sort of a cigarette, or it might have been a joint and he refused to put it out, and they're tackling him to the ground, and then when people retaliate, they throw them to the ground as well. So you don't see those scenes, and I know people will oftentimes say you don't see the peaceful scenes, but I mean they don't show the scenes where people are getting hurt, right? They always issue the reports on how many police officers were hurt, but the number of people who were hurt in the riots, I've known some people who were injured, like individuals, and they were never reported, like Baltimoreans were never reported, yeah.
And I found that they care a lot about property damage.
About that burning CVS.
The burning CVS, Baltimoreans are just burning down the city, and it's like they care so much about property and not at all about Black people's lives, and it's very interesting because you can rebuild a CVS and you cannot get back the life of Freddie Gray. You cannot get back the lives of people who have been killed by the police. And I think no one, in general, the media really isn't focusing on the root cause of the issue, which is that we need a systematic change in the police. And I don't know, I think that they care a lot about making things seem very dramatic and sensationalizing things. And I don't think they're really doing anything positive.
So you mentioned, about, property versus lives, and there's this hashtag Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people have been trying to say, well, hashtag all lives matter. So can you tell me, because on the surface people might seem, well, of course all lives matter, but can you explain, why people are so vehemently defending the discrepancy between the two catchphrases or hashtags?
Well, I mean, of course all lives matter. And we've been shown time and time again that white Americans' lives matter because we live in a society that's based off of white supremacy. So we know that white people's lives matter, and it's not about them at all. It's about Black people and people of color who are being targeted by the police. And that's why we're saying that Black lives matter, because no one seems to realize that they do. And the government does not seem to recognize that Black lives matter. And the police departments don't seem to recognize that Black lives matter. Of course they know that white lives matter. That's a given. This country was founded on genocide and slavery and oppression so that white people could have easier lives. We know that white people's lives matter. That has been shown to us time and time again.
And I would just add that saying the affirmation Black Lives Matter does not deny in any way the humanity and significance of other people's lives. It's just that we feel a need to announce it and to affirm what is not the status quo. It's not what people readily think and what they believe readily. So it's we need to proclaim it, to make it known, and to tell people that indeed Black lives do matter. And so when I find it strange when people get sort of offended, oh, you have the shirt that says Black Lives Matter, and it's so why are you making the statements? And it's part for education, but then another part for my own mental health and well-being, to reassure myself that I actually do matter. No matter what people have said to me, I am important, and we are all important.
So to kind of wrap things up, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of people who don't really know how to touch these issues, especially if they aren't African American. So what would you say to white students or Asian students, or really anyone who's not Black but wants to become engaged in these issues?
Well, I would say for minorities, so people who aren't white, you're not too far off, right? So there's this joke. I'm not good at jokes. Oh my gosh, it's a terrible joke actually. What am I saying? So something about they'll attack a Jew. Oh, okay. So, gosh, can you know what I'm talking about? So anyway, it goes something along the lines of if you're in a Black neighborhood and they start coming for the Black people, the Jews next door will start to get worried, and then after the Jews get worried, then it's the Mexicans get worried, or some order. I might have missed that up or whatever. But what I'm trying to say in too many words is that minorities are they are linked in some sort of common destiny, and that is the fact that they're not valued at the same rate as white Americans, and that's just a given fact. And you can see it in terms of economics, in terms of their housing situations, and a lot of different areas. And so I would say that, you know, getting involved with sort of the movement for Black justice, it does not mean that, you know, you are not fighting for something that's not pertinent to yourself, especially for minorities. But definitely for white people, for anyone actually, but this matters because you're an American. And this matters also beyond that because you are human, and these are human rights, right? The difference between human and civil rights is like, you know, civil rights is unique to that country or that state or area, but human rights are like for everyone. And I think that the murder of Freddie Gray and the murder of Eric Gardner, all these other unarmed African Americans, men and women, in genderqueer, everyone, is the fact that it is a human rights violation, and you know you should not turn away from it because it's attached to a certain race.
The only thing I would add is to like talk to people of color. You know, like I feel like this campus is very, very segregated, and I think that if you really want to get involved, go to the Black Student Union Facebook page. Talk to like Black people who go here. You know, like we exist.
Yeah.
We're in very small numbers.
People at our meetings.
Yeah, like come out and like show solidarity and show support and just show that you want to help, and like no one would ever get turned away if they have the right intentions.
No one will judge you for your lack of knowledge. If you're there to learn and if you're there to engage, then no one will turn you away. And if they do, they're terrible.
All right, Kennedy, Tiara, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily Herman, and thank you for joining us tonight on Politik Focus. See you next time.